The year was 1066. A king died in England, and he left behind no heir. Edward the Confessor, after years on the throne, passed away without children. This was the most dangerous moment for a country, because for the English throne, not one, but 3 people were laying claim, and none of them had any intention of backing down. One, Harold Godwinson, English nobleman, the man who effectively ruled the army and the country. 2, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, claimed the throne had been promised to him. 3, Harold Hardrada, Viking king, claimed rights based on old agreements. These 3 claims would lead to one outcome: war. The Battle of Hastings took place in the Sussex region in what is now southern England. Near the town of Hastings, Senlac Hill, Battle Hill, this hill would determine England's fate. The throne was vacant, armies were on the march. And the year 1066 was the year England would never be the same again. At Hastings, it wasn't just a battle that was won. A country was reborn. When Edward the Confessor died, the English throne was left vacant, and this void prompted 3 different men to act. The first contender was Harold Godwinson. Harold had been proclaimed king. The throne was his. But that didn't mean the war was over. Harold's claim: he was chosen by the Witan, the English nobles' council. He claimed Edward had pointed to him on his deathbed. Harold's problem was that he was on the throne. Harold knew his country. His army was English, loyal but limited. And Harold was facing 2 fronts at once. The second candidate was William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy. William claimed the throne had been promised to him. William's claim: Edward had promised him years earlier. Harold had sworn to this promise. According to William, Harold was a usurper. William was not just a nobleman. He was a disciplined military leader. His army was small but professional. The Norman army, heavy cavalry, archers, trained infantry. William was preparing for a single decisive blow. The third contender was the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada. Hardrada relied on old Viking agreements. He had come to conquer England. Harold had to defend the throne. William wanted to take the throne. Hardrada, meanwhile, was ready to burn and destroy it. In 1066, England was in the hands of 3 men. And of these 3 paths, only one would survive. The army marching on England from Hastings was no ordinary feudal force. This army had been trained for war. The Normans were actually descendants of the Vikings. These warriors from the north had settled in Normandy and, over time, had become Europe's finest soldiers. They were not raiders, but professionals. Duke William the Conqueror of Normandy planned his invasion of England months in advance. He promised land to the nobility, gained support from the church, and legitimized the campaign. This was not an adventure, but an organized invasion. William's army consisted of 3 parts: archers, the force that initiated the battle; infantry, the units that pushed the line; heavy cavalry, the element that delivered the final blow. This tripartite structure was unusual in England. It was the heavy cavalry that made the Norman army dangerous. Armored horses, trained riders, well-timed charges. This was a form of warfare the English were not accustomed to. The Norman archers were not merely a support unit. They were the first step that would change the course of the battle. The arrows would be fired to disrupt the enemy's formation. William prepared hundreds of ships to cross to England. This was a massive logistical feat for the 11th century. The Normans were not only coming to fight, but to settle. The army marching on England at Hastings was no ordinary feudal force. This army did not come to battle rested. It was one of two armies facing each other at Hastings. This army had already emerged from the battle. King Harold Godwinson of England sat on the throne, but he had no time. In September 1066, the first attack came not from the south, but from the north. The Vikings. King Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded England. Harold marched north with his army and inflicted a heavy defeat on the Vikings at Stamford Bridge. But the cost was high. The English army was exhausted. Experienced soldiers were lost. The army could not rest. It was a victory, but an expensive one. Before Harold could celebrate his victory, news arrived. William had landed in England. Harold had to march about 300 kilometers from north to south. Tired soldiers, wounded troops, an army advancing without rest. Harold had a choice: wait and gather strength, or attack immediately. He chose to attack immediately, because time was Harold's enemy. The reason was that the Normans were growing stronger, more soldiers were arriving. The English nobles could scatter. Harold thought that if he delayed, he would lose. The English army marching to Hastings was exhausted, and facing them was a well-rested enemy. At the Battle of Hastings, the initial advantage came not from the sword, but from the terrain. The battle took place on a hill called Senlac Hill, located in what is now southern England. This hill was just north of the town of Hastings and served as a natural defensive line for the English. Harold Godwinson positioned his army at the top of this hill. This was the right decision from a military standpoint. Why? Defense from a height. An uphill attack by the enemy was ideal for the English infantry. Harold wanted to use geography to compensate for his disadvantages in numbers and fatigue. The strength of the English army lay not in movement, but in holding its ground. The soldiers placed their shields side by side to form a shield wall. When used correctly, this wall was nearly impenetrable. This hill posed a major problem for William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy. His army relied on movement to win. Heavy cavalry and archers lose their advantage going uphill. Harold was waiting for the enemy. William had to dislodge him. It was a battle between patience and strength. Harold had another advantage: time. The longer he held out, the more exhausted the Normans would become. But this was only possible if the shield wall remained intact. At the Hill of Hastings, the English had the initial advantage. For William to win, he had to break this wall. At the top of Hastings Hill, the two armies finally halted. There was no turning back now. Harold Godwinson positioned his army at the summit of the hill. The English would not move. Shields side by side, spears forward, no gaps. It was a wall that would be hard to break. Opposite them stood the army of William the Conqueror. The Normans formed a three-layered formation. The order: archers in front, infantry behind, heavy cavalry at the rear. This formation was designed to win through movement. The Norman archers started the battle. Arrows flew, but the effect was limited. The shield wall stood too high. The arrows bounced off the wall and fell. Then the Norman infantry charged uphill. Shields clashed, lines shook, but the wall held. Cavalry charges were also attempted. The horses' strength waned uphill. As the first hours passed at Hastings, the battle reached a stalemate. Neither the English retreated nor the Normans advanced. William realized he could not win this way. The shield wall could not be broken by force. The initial moves at Hastings had yielded no results, and William had to change the game. The battle at Hastings Hill had reached a stalemate, and it was at this very moment that the tide turned. Something unexpected happened in a section of the Norman lines. The troops began to retreat. At first glance, it looked like panic. Whether this retreat was deliberate or reflexive has been debated for centuries, but the outcome remains unchanged. This move changed the fate of the battle. Some units in Harold Godwinson's army mistook this retreat for a sign of victory. Soldiers broke away from the shield wall and began chasing the Normans. This was the moment the wall broke. The English soldiers abandoned their high ground advantage and descended the slope in disarray. This was the mistake William had been waiting for. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, gave a sudden order to the retreating troops. Turn! The fleeing soldiers instantly became attackers. The English troops descending the slope were now defenseless. There was no shield wall, no order. Norman cavalry cut them down one by one. This feigned retreat was repeated not once, but several times, and each time the English line weakened a little more. At Hastings, a wall did not fall. The wall collapsed on its own. The battle at Hastings Hill had been raging for hours, and the English army was now fighting not only the enemy, but also exhaustion. Feigned retreats had fragmented the English line. The shield wall was still standing, but was now incomplete, and this gap was advancing toward the center. King Harold Godwinson of England was at the center of his army. Because English kings did not stand in the rear, they died alongside their men. At this point in the battle, the Norman archers re-entered the fray. This time, the arrows were shot at a steeper angle. The arrows falling from above reached behind the shield wall. Sources describe this moment in different ways, but one thing is certain. Harold died during this attack. Possible scenarios. He was seriously wounded by an arrow and then killed by Norman soldiers. Being shot in the eye is the most common account. When a king falls in an army, the battle is over. Harold's death broke English resistance. Command ceased, order collapsed. English soldiers began retreating from the center. This was no longer a battle, but a rout. A king died at Hastings, and England was left leaderless. After Harold's fall, there were no longer two armies on Hastings Hill. There was one army, and a scattered crowd. Some English troops continued to resist, unaware that their king was dead. Particularly on the upper part of the hill, small groups made their last stand. But this resistance would not change the outcome. The Norman cavalry no longer held back, for before them stood an army without command. Horses that could not climb the slope were now descending it. This was a complete collapse. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, did not prolong the battle. He did not pursue the fleeing troops relentlessly, because his target was not the battlefield, but the country. By sunset, the English army had completely disintegrated. The survivors fled into the forest, some surrendered, and the Battle of Hastings ended there. This victory was not just a field battle. It was the change of hands of England. The island, ruled by English nobles for centuries, was now in Norman hands. A king died at Hastings, and a conqueror was born. The battle at Hastings was over, but the real change was just beginning. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, advanced towards London after his victory. The cities did not resist. The nobles surrendered one by one, because now they were facing a victorious army. On December 25th, 1066, on Christmas Day, William was proclaimed King of England at Westminster. This date marked not just the coronation, but the end of an era. William did not rule England from afar, he redistributed the land. He removed the English nobles from their positions and replaced them with Normans. The old elite class was almost completely wiped out. The Normans covered the country with castles, motte and bailey castles, a new feudal order, strict military control. This was not an occupation, but a permanent conquest. By William's order, the Domesday Book was compiled in 1086. Who owned what? How much tax would they pay? Everything was written down. For the first time in English history, such a strict state was born. The language of government was French. The language of the people was English. This conflict laid the foundation for modern English. 1066 changed not only politics, but also language. The Battle of Hastings is one of the most decisive battles of the Middle Ages, because the fate of an island changed in a single day. In 1066, England lost, and the England we know was born there.